Hello and welcome to the Primarch's Playbook. I'm Toby Bennett from Black Crow Gaming, and today we are going to be talking about Indirect and why it's going to be so relevant as we go into this next phase of the meta. So as said, Indirect is back, and it's going to be probably quite big as we go. So for Space Marines, obviously Desolators have seen a bit of an uptick recently. They are really quite solid, even though they're 200 points a unit, which is still pretty pricey. But they've been seeing some performance at high tables. And the reason that likely is a shift in the meta, and that comes down to the Guard and Aeldari codexes, or codices being released and now currently available. And that's from things like Bridgehead, which is obviously a really vile damage output Scions list, very, very powerful. And then also Aeldari, it's just that kind of, you need to interact with them without that line of sight. So it can just be a little bit difficult if you don't bring some kind of indirect. And things like Desolators, or in fact Whirlwinds, are very good at just dealing with those Aeldari units before they're able to get in and do their damage, because they are still very glass cannony, they are still squishy elves, so if you can deal with them early, great. That is really, really important. Obviously Indirect did take a nerf, and you can't hit on anything that's below a 4, but that's reasonably easy to do in quite a few factions. So obviously Bridgehead have rerolls, we have rerolls, and there are multiple other factions. So I think GSC has got quite a lot of indirect as well, or at least the indirect it does have is easily spammable and is seeing play. If you've gone against Bridgehead recently, you'll have probably seen the 9 mortar teams, which are absolutely horrible. And then, of course, they've just had a lovely new model come out, which is like a heavy siege mortar or something like that. Really cool looking model, absolutely disgustingly horrible profile. Not one that I'm looking forward to going up against, but it is definitely a sign that Indirect is back. So what we need to do is work out how we can use Indirect, how effective it is for Space Marines, and then also how can we counter it. So that's exactly what this video is going to be all about, and it is very much targeted again at the more competitive player. If you're just sort of chilling around in your friendship group, then you're less likely to need these tips, which I think is probably a good thing, because Indirect is quite a polarizing effect. A lot of people don't like it. They find it uninteractive. I'm not going to dispute that, but it is part of the game. So it's something that I feel like if we prep ourselves for, especially as it potentially becomes a lot more relevant, hopefully it will take sting from it as well, which should hopefully help us in the long run, and at least we don't have to worry about triple Manticore at the moment, although now that I've said that, spot triple Manticore meta coming in. So, Desolators. Why are they good? The main one is actually the Venga launchers. So it's basically everything to do with the Sergeant, because the Sergeant originally came with a little bit of equipment in 9th edition that gave them like ignore cover, and then that became their ability if they stand still. And then the Vengor launcher is strength 6, AP 2, and damage. Might be AP 1, sorry, actually, because it's ignore cover. And damage 2, yeah, I think it's actually around that. That innate ignore cover, though, is obviously huge because it just nullifies one of the main bonuses. It nullifies 50% of the bonus that you get from your opponent firing indirect at you, which is obviously you always gain cover. So that itself is quite frustrating for your opponent to deal with. And then all of the indirect here has Blast, which can make it very good at just chipping away at those 5-man units. So very good at killing 5-man Aeldari, Drakari, anything that's T3 really. And it's also actually surprisingly efficient with the strength 4 AP-1 damage. So it's basically an indirect bolter, but with blast and D3 shots. And it can just really take out a lot of targets very quickly. But then that Vengor launcher can actually start threatening things like Space Marine squads. And sometimes it can actually just pick them up. And then alongside that, we've also got the bonus crack missiles, super crack missiles, in fact. So they're strength 10, AP2, damage D6 plus 1, which is nasty. Like, it's just a random bit of extra anti-tank that can really put the hurt in. So couple that with that consistent ability to always cause damage to your opponent. And Desolators are suddenly just such a relevant unit. Obviously, they are 200 points a unit, and they are just standard intercessors in terms of their defensive profiles. There is nothing special there. But if they are just sitting and hiding, they can do quite well for themselves. And if you are playing in the UK, it's also worth mentioning that if you're playing on UK TC terrain, you can get plunging fire with them as well. And alongside the ignore cover ability, that can really put a dent in your opponents. That's when suddenly that Vengor launcher becomes AP2 ignore cover, pushing Space Marines up to 5s and dying each save they fail. And then also the mini shots, just by sheer weight of fire from that -1 and ignore cover, can get really nasty, even for things like Marines. But obviously that does mean that because they have to be on like the top row, I think it is, that does expose them and they can get return fired. So just be aware of that. But if you're against something like World Eaters, where they're not shooting you, like stick them up top and just pound away. And your opponent will not enjoy that. So, I think Desolators are an incredibly good squad. 200 points, they are expensive, and it's very expensive if your opponent does have Indirect and you don't have a way to protect them. So be aware of that as Indirect becomes more relevant. We will talk about that later. So Desolators, I think, are the go-to for Space Marine Indirect currently. Unfortunately, the models look a little bit poo, but it is what it is. I think they are they're pointed probably correctly now. They should never really be a spammable unit. And I think the other really good positive is that with being limited to 5-mans and it being a lot more difficult to give them that sustained hits on 5s, although we'll come on to that later as well because of the change to fire discipline, that's reined Desolators in, so they are now just a solid unit rather than a broken unit. So that's Desolators. Next, we've got Whirlwinds, which are the firstborn Indirect tanks. They are currently seeing less play. I've not really seen them in quite a few of the top lists, which does surprise me a bit because, to me, I think they could be really good with with Oath of Moment, particularly if you're playing something like Reboot. So you go, right, Oath of Moment, that unit, second Oath into that unit, Whirlwind the absolute crap out the first unit, and then switch to the next. I think that could be really solid, but it's not, unfortunately. Could you play it as a slightly worse Plague Burst Crawler? Maybe. It doesn't come with entropy cannons and it doesn't come with a top save, but it could reasonably fill that role. It's a very good Marine killer with the strength 8 AP2 damage 2 profile. It's fine at doing that. It's a tad expensive. A tad expensive at 180 points, and I think currently it's really losing out to Vindicators being 175. When you are thinking of those kind of... they do very different roles, but I think they're still just losing out to Vindicators, which is a shame, but it's also not a shame because it's more Indirect, which is not much fun to deal with. But it's something that I think that if you are seeing a lot of Indirect in your meta, I would potentially opt for those Whirlwinds, because they don't need that additional support to keep them safe that Desolators do need, because most Indirect is not the strength where it can feasibly deal with a tank efficiently, and if they do, they 90% of the time they won't be able to pick up a tank in a single activation, and the likelihood is that a Whirlwind will be able to pick up opposing indirect fire with like the heavy weapons teams and things like that. It will be able to pick them up in a single activation, which is obviously a very good trade, and then you won that indirect war and you can have fun with the rest of their army. So obviously, if you're not going into indirect, however, both whirlwinds and desolators are still extremely brutal because they just offer damage where your opponent can't get to you. So if you're playing on things like Purge the Foe, a lot of the times, obviously, it's impossible to get the damage into your opponent if you go first, because if they have deployed correctly, then they're just not going to give you any targets. But obviously indirect doesn't care about that, so it's a really good way of just dealing with issues like that. It's a really good way of dictating the pace of the game, because you go, okay, I can feasibly I should pick up a unit a turn with my indirect, which then causes my opponent problems. So yeah, I think that's probably sort of why Space Marines should lean into indirect. I think at the moment, desolators, you can just have 5 of them in there, which is 200 points. However, whirlwinds, I think you do need multiple just to actually get them to be efficient and to get them targeting those bigger targets. Because feasibly, I think whirlwinds, not only are they wounding infantry on 2s, with the +1 to wound from Oath, they're wounding tanks on 4s. So there's a lot more scope where, if you triple whirlwind up, you can bully a lot of opponents, but equally that is nearly 600 points, which is quite expensive. So that might be why that's seeing less play at the moment. They do also come with a hunter killer missile, which that's not a bad thing. So be cognizant of whirlwinds. They might come up for you. And as I say, if you are in a heavy indirect meta, then I would definitely consider picking some whirlwinds up just to deal with your opponent's indirect, just so you don't have to think about it too much. And especially that 72-inch range means you can hit anything on the board. And when those sirens drop, you can go, cool, don't care, you're gone, which is pretty damn useful. Okay, so that's whirlwinds. Next, we're going to talk very quickly about countering indirect, because I've actually just done an article about this, like a long form written article about this on my Patreon. So do go check that out if you want to hear a little bit more about that. But the best ways to counter indirect is obviously with things like lone ops, just so you can keep accelerating your primary. Now, the reason for that is that a lot of the time indirect, especially things like desolators, are going to go after your point scoring units. So think about what units are sitting on objectives early. A lot of the time on your expansion and things like that, it's probably a scout unit or things like that. And those are the kind of units that get absolutely chewed to pieces by those indirect guns. So that's not a fun place to be in, because it's just going to deny your natural primary expansion. So having a lone op to be able to sit on that expansion objective, be that the combi lieutenant, or perhaps maybe an assassin, or in fact it could be Rabute or the lion, because they are given lone op by having guys near them. That's really going to benefit you. So just, I think lone ops are going up in stock a little bit more. I think they're potentially a little bit stronger. It's like scouts have always been our go-to in that department, but lone ops, so particularly the lone op lieutenant, benefiting the rest of the army even more so with indirect, with his reroll 1s to wound, a reactive move, which we know is very powerful, and then that ability to just ignore your opponent's indirect. I think that could be worth the 70 points now. So lone ops are the first one. The next is to bum rush them, and what I mean by bum rush is just get super aggressive and really go for the throat with them. This is probably a lot better with Space Marine melee builds, so maybe the Ultramarine Stormlance build, the Dark Angels Stormlance build, or perhaps the Space Wolves Champions of Rust build. And that's basically what you're doing there, is you're just applying a lot of early pressure on your opponent, which is then making them target those pressuring units with the indirect rather than your scoring units, because if they're having to target units that you're pressuring them with, they can't prioritize units so that they then start dictating the pace of the game, because essentially what the main focus of these indirect pieces is that they want to kill off units that are going to score you points, which then force you to put something relevant on the primary point. So, for example, when I went up against desolators, they just went and focused on units that could sit on primary, so that I then had to put a ballista dreadnought on primary, which takes one of my big guns out of the fight. So that's a really good way of just kind of stopping your opponent from being able to commit all of their resources into killing you, because you just take out those other units. But obviously, if you are pressuring them early and you're forcing them to deal with a lot of units up in their face, they're not going to be able to have that headspace to, or even just the number of guns, to actually deal with those units that are scoring you primary. Instead, they've got to focus on the ones that are in their face, threatening to get the charges into their indirect units, all that kind of thing. So a good old-fashioned bum rush, there's nothing wrong with that. It's really quite solid. And then finally, obviously, we've got counter indirect, but just remember, bring either Whirlwinds or an Impulsor to keep them safe. The Impulsor, obviously, with firing deck 6, it just means that your indirect is going to win that indirect war before they then get out and take advantage of their ignore cover ability. So it's just worth bearing in mind that you might need to bring an Impulsor. And if you are doing that and you don't come up against other indirect lists, then it's worth having another unit that can go in there. That might be Infernus Marines. That could be your bog standard Assault Intercessors. I would love to see Lieutenant Titus with some Assault Intercessors or something like that. Maybe with Blade Guard, actually, those kinds of units. I think that could be really quite solid. So I would like to see that a little bit more, but yeah. So counter indirect with Impulsors is worth bringing as well. And again, particularly if you are looking at a very heavy guard meta, bring your own indirect and make sure that you can keep it safe, because as we've already stated, it's quite an expensive investment in that 200 point unit of desolators. If they die and they're not that difficult to kill, guard could probably pick up 4 of them in a turn with their own indirect. Then you're in trouble. So just bear that in mind when you're building. It's something that is quite relevant. And then let's talk about sort of getting the best out of your indirect. And that it does seem to be with the rise of the Anvil Siege Force. Now, this was something that I didn't really expect to be saying, and I really didn't expect to see Anvil performing as well as it had, but the sort of genius minds of Ed Watts and Ben Jones have been able to get a lot out of it. So big shout out to 6++ and Vanguard Tactics for that. I obviously had the pleasure of going up against Ben Jones as well, so I've experienced a list like this firsthand, and I can say that the damage output is very, very nasty. Those desolators are so good at just dictating the pace of the game to your opponent, and it forced me to really give him a bum rush, which obviously I love doing. You know, who doesn't love a bum rush with Stormlance? But it was a really interesting way to interact with it, and it threw a bit of a spanner in the works for me thinking. And obviously the more spanners you throw in your opponent's thought process, the more likely they are to make a mistake, which you can capitalize on. So why is it really good? So they have the crits on 5s if they've stood still with sustained stratagem, which is broken with those lovely desolators. It means that they just go, oh cool, there's a unit there. No, there's not. Especially if they oath it. So those early turns when you're usually generating extra CP to do that, you just pop it away, pick up a unit like it's nothing. Really, really solid. Then next, Anvil interacts very nicely with Vindicators. They do, I think, miss out on advanced shoot, but the fact that they get the +1 to hit when they're shooting, if they get locked in combat, it's not a bad thing, because they already don't take any negative modifiers, but then they're getting +1 to hit as well because they stood still. So they're hitting on 2s in combat, which is surprisingly nasty. But then also, if they've sat still, they can benefit from that crits on 5 sustained stratagem as well, which, as you can imagine with a Vindicator, is pretty damn brutal. So as I say, they just get the most out of those desolators, and because Marines have such a wide roster of different things, They can bring so many different like contact points to bear that Anvil just forces your opponent to think in so many different ways that, again, they're likely to make a mistake at some point. I know that I definitely made a mistake early game of not just really going for the throat until I think it was turn 2 where I just went, right, sod it, let's go. And that's when the game sort of started to turn in my favour. But I didn't clock that first, and it might be that an opponent doesn't clock that until it's too late. So yeah, I think Anvil is probably here to stay. We've seen 3 good finishes, 2 of them obviously by Ed and 1 by Ben, 1 at LVO and 2 at the recent Coventry ITT. Yeah, I think it is here to stay, but I think it's also got quite a high skill bottom. Like, you've got to be decent at positioning to use this army. Like, it's very, very important to position it correctly. But equally, like, if you want to see more on this, just go watch Ed's video on 6++. He's the guy that made it. He's the guy that got the 5-1 at LVO with it. Like, you know, he's a very, very talented player. I think he's on Team England. So, you know, I can't remember fully, in all honesty. But yeah, go watch that content. I will try and link it, if I remember, in the description. But yeah, go check that out if you are thinking, oh, Anvil, that might be for me. And then finally, just to kiss Ed's bum a little bit more, I stole Ed Watt's list because he's actually good at this game. Sub to 6++ if you smart. Which, yes, I completely agree. Because they know how they know how to build lists good, I've heard. They're quite talented at that over at 6++. They've got a good crop of guys. So I'll quickly run over the list. Obviously, I've had a game into this. I've not played it myself, but I have fought against it with my Dark Angel Stormlance. So it's Calgar and the Company Heroes, because fuck me, are they durable. They are so good because obviously they take it on one of the Victrix Guard at first, so they have the 4-up invuln with that -1 to wound, and then it's 4 wound Space Marines until they're all dead, and then it's 1 Victrix and Calgar, and then Calgar starts taking it on him, and he's got a 4-up Feel No Pain. It's just absolutely horrible. So I love that unit. I think it's brilliant. The amount of damage output, and it also gives something advanced shoot and advanced charge. And also it's a high OC unit. So it's something that Anvil, I think, was lacking, and Calgar really fills that hole very well. Then, as we've already mentioned, Lone Up Lieutenant, just really good damage multiplier, and it's also just very good at making sure that you're scoring your secondaries, especially as we go into this more indirect heavy meta. Speaking of that, Phobos Librarian, to give Lone Up to shock horror, it's the Infiltrators most of the time, and that's because Infiltrators are the nastiest unit against Bridgehead currently. I think it was over on Fireside Chat, David Gaylard, who was one of sort of the key players in building that best Bridgehead list, said that Infiltrators are a nightmare. That's why he put the Indirect in. But the Phobos Librarian just shuts it down. So really, really efficient there. And if you don't want to put it on the Infiltrators because your opponent doesn't have Indirect or doesn't have that much Deep Strike, put them on the Incursors, because then suddenly you've got a really good skirmishing mid-board unit that just happens to have Lone Op and Stealth. So that's not bad at all. And also, he's no slouch in shooting. That Smite ability, I really like it. I think it pops off sometimes. So next, we've got some intercessors to sticky objectives, and that's just to give a little bit more freedom to those desolators. Obviously, the immediate instinct is, well, let's put either the infiltrators or the desolators on the home objective, and we'll stop worrying about it. But actually, no. A lot of the time, you want those infiltrators stringing across the midboard just to screen your opponent's deep strike, all that kind of good stuff. And you want to be able to sticky home so you can get more guns in the game. And also those intercessors getting +1 to wound if they stand still is just, it's pretty nasty. There was 20 shots, so it can do damage. And I've been impressed. I've been really impressed with intercessors recently since they glow up. Next, obviously, we've got Incursors, as I've already mentioned, so +1 to hit for whatever they shoot. Which is pretty damn nice with Vindicators. Obviously, this is quite a gunline army, so if your opponent does have like lots of stealth and things like that, or you're having to shoot things that aren't the Oath target, incursors just make that a little bit easier to do. And then the haywire mine is just super bonus as well. Next, obviously, we talked about infiltrators a lot already. They're just super good. And if bridgehead is big in your meta, bring infiltrators. Next, desolators. Wow, who'd have thought? There's the indirect piece. Brutal, as already discussed, because of that stratagem. They're just super nasty. Personally, I despise them, but they're super good. I think I probably will play them at some point. Next, we've got some Infernus, which surprised me, but they're a great unit to put in that Impulsor to benefit from the firing deck. They just absolutely tear chaff to pieces. And they give you a nasty Overwatch threat too, which I think is going to be quite relevant going into this new meta with Aeldari. Obviously, remember that does not work with firing decks, so you do have to be smart with when you get them out of the Impulsor if they're in the Impulsor over the Desolators. But for what they do, I think Infernus just are really solid. So I've been very impressed with them so far. The Impulsor is there to primarily protect those Desolators, but obviously if you pop the Infernus in there, it makes a really nasty flame bus, so that can be a lot of fun. Next, got some Scouts just to score some points. Infiltrate's not bad at all. The Gladiator Reaper, again, another really nasty Overwatch threat. That sustain 2 just means like every time you roll it, and with 12 shots and sustain 2, it means on average you're getting about 6 hits per Overwatch, and that's before all the other nasty little shots. So it's super good at just picking up opposing infantry and killing those sort of scoring units. So I think that this is the big thing with this army. I mean, again, go watch Ed's video. He's going to describe this way better than me. But they're going to absolutely slaughter any scoring piece that exposes itself, or in the case of the Desolators, doesn't expose itself. So it just makes scoring points really difficult for your opponent. Next, 3 Vindicators. It's because they're really good and they have loads of nasty damage output. Yay! I've been super impressed with them. So yeah, Vindicators, they're great. Love them. And then a couple of jump pack intercessors just to score those points. And also because they're a really good little screening effect. Again, they do damage at any point of the game because they do impact mortals, all that good stuff. So if you are considering Indirect and you are considering playing Gunline Marines, this is a really good place to start. I'm a big fan of it. Having played into it, it's really good. I don't know if like I'm a good matchup for it as a like Dark Angels player, but like maybe I honestly I'm not sure. Like I need to see it more in action, but like the records speak for themselves. But obviously do take that with a pinch of salt because Ed and Ben are far more skilled than the average player. Shock horror that those guys being pretty damn good at the game. Who'd have thought? So yeah, just bear that in mind when you take this. And I think Ed in a comment thread on Facebook did say, you know, this is quite an army where you do have to nail that positioning. So yeah, like that's worth bearing in mind when you do bring this. That'll take time, practice your deployment, all those kinds of good things. So hopefully that's given you some lessons on how to use Indirect for Marines, how to counter Indirect with Marines, and obviously there is that article that I posted on Patreon that you can go and read. And then also it's given you a list where you can go and play a really good list, and lots of fun as well. It is a super fun list. Those strats are great fun. So yeah, check this out. If you like Gunline Marines, go do that. And go watch Ed's video. It's brilliant. Go subscribe to 6++ as well. And speaking of subscribing, do please subscribe to us. We try and produce lots of good content as well. I do a couple of series on here. I enjoy it. It's good fun. I like talking shit about Space Marines. They're cool. Obviously, I'm a Dark Angels player main, but sod it. We're going to talk about all sorts. But yeah, so give us a subscribe. Give us a like. Give us a follow on Facebook. Give us a follow on Instagram. You can, if you like, you can go subscribe to my Patreon, which is Angelus Mortis 40k. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, just Angelus Mortis Coaching, I think it is. And if you do want me to teach you how to play the game, or teach you how to do better in the game, I'm here to do that. So you can go book a session over on my website, which is angelis-mortis.co.uk. Just something that I'm trying out so that I can spend a little bit more time playing 40k. And I'm really enjoying it so far. Helping people is kind of a passion for me. I love being able to support people. It's been something that I've done in my professional career with sort of business support and things like that. So it's really fun to be able to do that and kind of pay for my tournaments with it, which is really beneficial for me being able to get out there, create new content for you guys, and just learn more about the meta as well. And to be honest, get more reps for me so I improve, because that's the most important thing. Like, my aim is to try and beat more players on international teams this year. And that's not easy. That's a hell of a challenge. These guys are very, very skilled. But it's something that I want to do, and it's something that I really want to achieve. So yeah, I need to turn up at more tournaments and play at least decently. But yeah, I really hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you so much to our sponsors, Glasshammer Gaming and Terrainforge. You can head over to Glasshammer to get cheap models and use the code BlackCrow at checkout to get another 5% off. And you can go and get some lovely bespoke terrain from Terrainforge using the code BCG5 for another 5% off at checkout. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. And indirect the shit out of your opponent because it's great fun. Happy Valentine's Day. See you later. Bye.